Vaisheshik Darshan, which was formulated primarily by Acharya Kannad, gives an ontological framework that encompasses 6 different kinds of categories or padarth and looks at 3 major elements, right? The dravya, the gun, and the karma. Right? Dravya being the substance, guna being the characteristic, you can call it, right? And karma relating to the action side of things. Now, Acharya Kannad told us about the way in which different atoms or different fundamental elements of nature conjoin and come together, right? So they have different patterns that they use. I mean, so there are, for instance, dyads being 2 different atoms coming together. There are triads, tetrads, and so on and so forth. Acharya Prashastapad, he was more towards the dyadic side of things. He spoke about how dyads come to be, how 2 different atoms can come together. And in one of his very seminal texts, which is the Padartha Dharma Sangraha, in the text 84 of Padartha Dharma Sangraha, Acharya Prashastapad tells us about how when heat is applied to different kinds of objects, primarily to do with, let's say, jars made of clay or certain other substances, how the various movements that happen, right, in the material itself because of the application of heat, how that kind of brings about significant changes in characteristics. So, for instance, the color aspect of that jar has been spoken of in the text 84 of the Padartha Dharma Sangraha, and he speaks about how the idea of disjunction happens, right? Which means how the composition of the jar, right, which is a conjunction of different atoms, different elements, that kind of gives way to a disjunction of sorts, right? So this is a very important aspect, so to say. In Vaisheshik Darshan, there are both of these ideas of samyoga and vibhaga, right, which means conjunction and disjunction. And there are certain aspects of these samskaras, right, which is these tendencies that are out there, right? So you have basically vega, which is basically velocity. You can talk about velocity with respect to that. Bhavana, which is basically disposition, and sthitistapak, which is basically your idea of elasticity, right? How the elasticity aspects comes into the picture. Now, besides these tendencies, we also have the influence of adrishta, which is basically this idea of this unseen force that applies its influence on all the various phenomenological or physical objects and elements, so to say. In modern physics, we know that the way particles interact is usually with respect to the fundamental forces of nature, right? So there are 4 different fundamental forces as we know it. There is electromagnetism, there is strong force, there is weak force, and then there is gravity, right? Now, gravity, interestingly, has a mention in the Vaisheshik Darshan, so to say. So when we talk about gravity, Acharya Anam Bhatt, he talks about it as the first non-inherent cause of falling, right? Of something which is falling from, let's say, some height, so to say. And the term that is used is Gurutva, right? We all have heard about Gurutvaakarshan, right? So Gurutva is spoken about. And there is a sutra, a shlok from the Vaisheshik Sutra, which says, Sanyoga bhave Gurutva patanam. Right? Sanyoga bhave gurutva patanam, right? Which means that without the element of conjunction, in the absence of conjunction, that which causes something to fall, patanam is that which, makes something fall, is gurutva. Right, is the element of gravity, if you will. But I mean, gravity is something we have interpolated now, right? But back in the day, it could have encompassed something more than that, but it definitely encompasses this element of an object falling, so to say, right? Now, heat transfer in physics, right? There are 3 different modes in which it usually happens, right? So one is radiation, then there is conduction, and there is convection, right? So radiation, we have seen that there are many different ways in which light and heat is spoken about in Vaisheshik Sutra and also in different other Indian knowledge systems. But what is very interesting is in the idea of conduction, right? So when conduction is spoken about, we see that Nyaya, right, says that there are certain heat corpuscles, right? Heat particles almost, right? And they kind of move into the different, the structure of the object itself, right? But they don't lead to the disintegration or the disjunction, so to say, right? So this idea is called the doctrine of Pitharapak, right? Which is basically this idea that there's no disjunction per se. Now, Vaisheshik has a slightly variant kind of purview on this, a slightly different perspective, where it does talk about the disjunction of the composition, so to say, and the effect of the heat corpuscles or the heat itself on the different constituents of a certain composition, let's say, right? So in that sense, it's called, there's a different doctrine altogether, which is spoken of as Pilupaka, right? So Pitharapaka and Pilupak, which is basically the Nyaya and the Vaisheshik aspect of heat transfer, so to say. Now, convection is not explicitly mentioned, but obviously convection, because tejas, right? This idea of heat, or the idea of, you wouldn't call it radiation per se, but heat is the best kind of you speak about. Teja, right? We talk about teja. So that itself has an effect on different kinds of elements in nature, right? And different physical objects, so to say. And that leads to motion as well, right? Now, whether that is graded motion, right? Convection talks about how the hot air goes up and the cold air comes down, right? Is something which has not been mentioned in those terms necessarily, but in other ways it has been presented in some of the works, so to say. So we see that in the Indian knowledge systems and in Vaisheshik Darshan, there have been a lot of different nuances of heat, of energy transfer, of energy distribution, how heat makes an impact on any physical object, so to say, which is quite advanced, so to say, right? I mean, because if you look at it from the physical perspective today,
it seems like, right, that they understood
the various aspects.
Temperature and heat.
Absolutely, right? And in fact, I would say they went one step further. They also looked at it from the microscopic perspective, right? They looked at it, this idea, the heat corpuscles, right? It talks about this thing that where is this agitation in the system coming from, right? Why is that coming about, right? That comes because of the interaction of the heat corpuscles with the elements in the body, right?
The fundamentals
of thermodynamics, right? Kinetic theory, statistical mechanics, right? So that is a beautiful kind of perspective, so to say, which I really appreciated studying about in my own time and, writing about as well. So that gives you a really good idea that, our people, the Indian knowledge systems had quite an advanced understanding of that. Yeah.